Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where each story is a new mystery waiting to be solved. Grab a coffee. Stay curious and experience the pleasure with other mystery fans. Let's get started. Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Final Portrait, Chapter 1. A Matter of Perspective. In November of 1887, a series of unusually dead fogs appeared to convert our beloved London into a metropolis of shadows and half-formed shapes. During one such morning, Sherlock Holmes and I faced one of the most unusual cases of our lengthy association. The peculiar occurrences I'm going to recount challenged not only my friend's exceptional reasoning powers, but also our very concept of what is possible within the confines of natural law. I awoke early that morning to find Holmes already deeply engrossed in one of his chemical experiments. The sitting room at 221B Baker Street was heavy with the acrid smell of his latest investigation, something to do with the detection of certain alkaloids, though I confess that the precise nature of his research escaped me. The coal fire was low, and Mrs. Hudson had not yet arrived with breakfast, leaving the room in that special state of comfortable disarray that Holmes seemed to prefer for his scientific pursuits, while my friend hunched over his apparatus sometimes, writing observations in his precise hand. I engaged myself with the morning moments. The fog outside our windows had reduced the street to little more than vague shapes and muffled sounds, with the occasional clip-clop of horse hooves on cobblestones, seeming to come from somewhere far more distant than Baker Street below. It was in this peaceful scene we were suddenly interrupted by an urgent hammering at our door. A youthful man, Holmes said, returning to his test too, and one who has walked some distance through the fog to get us painters' materials cling to his clothing, unless I am much incorrect, before I could query how he had drawn these conclusions from mere footprints on our staircase. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a gentleman who proved Holmes right on all counts. He was indeed young, perhaps no more than 25, dressed in the somewhat affected style favored by London's artistic community. His elegant FRCK coat and carefully arranged cravat spoke of means, but both showed signs of having been hastily donned. His top hat, which he removed with trembling hands, exposed a shock of auburn hair arranged in the most exquisite fashion. Mr. Holmes' voice began to quaver with barely repressed anguish. "I am James Whitmore, the assistant of the painter Gerald Blackwood, sir. I believe something awful has happened at the studio." Holmes' keen eyes swept over our visitor, taking in every detail in that remarkable way of his. "You've come directly from Chelsea, I see, and you've been handling oil paints recently, cadmium yellow if I'm not mistaken." Whitmore started visibly, his already pale face showing even greater alarm. "Yes, but how could you possibly? The slight yellow beneath your fingernails has a particular hue unique to that pigment," Holmes interrupted with a dismissive wave. "Additionally, the distinctive clay of the Chelsea streets clings to your boots, and the fresh spatters indicate you walked at least part of the way in your haste to reach us. Please continue with your story." "It's Mr. Blackwood, sir. This morning I found him here." Whitmore's voice trembled, and he had to steady himself against the back of my chair. "Discovered him dead in his studio, but it's not just the death, Mr. Holmes. It's the painting, his final effort. You must see for yourself. I dare not tell more." Holmes's brow raised slightly at these comments, and he placed aside his chemical apparatus with deliberate care. "Watson, if you would be so good as to follow me, it appears we have an issue worthy of our attention. But do bring your pistol. These artistic types can be unpredictable." The fog had thickened considerably by the time our hansom deposited us in front of a handsome Queen Anne house in Chelsea. The building stood slightly back from the street, its red brick facade appearing and disappearing in the swirling mist like some ghostly magic lantern show. As we followed Whitmore up the steps, I noticed Holmes's gaze lingering on the distinctive brass doorknob, though its significance escaped me at the time. The studio occupied the entire top floor, its lay easel strewn about holding canvases in various stages of completion tables. loaded with palettes and brushes, and that particular smell of oil paint and turpentine that is universal to all painters. Studio's Gerald Blackwood lay sprawled before his easel, a palette still clutched in his lifeless hand. He was a man of middle years dressed in a paint-stained smock, his silver hair wild about his head. But it was the canvas before him that drew our immediate attention. A self-portrait of extraordinary detail, showing the artist in the exact position in which he now lay dead. Holmes mumbled, producing his lens and commencing a cautious investigation of the situation. "Watson, your medical opinion if you please. And do not disturb the paint tray by the artist's left foot." As I bent to examine the body, I heard the distant toll of church bells marking the hour, aware that they were chiming the beginning of one of our most Byzantine investigations. The fog pressed against the studio windows, as if nature herself sought to peer in at the extraordinary scene before us. A dead artist, a prophetic painting, and a mystery that would test looking back now. I realized that even then, in those first moments of the investigation, Holmes had already observed several crucial details that would eventually lead us to the truth. But at the time, like the fog outside, everything was shrouded in uncertainty. And we stood at the threshold of what would prove to be one of the most remarkable cases in all my years of chronicling Holmes' adventures. Chapter 2. The Colors of Deception. After finishing my examination of Gerald Blackwood's body, I straightened up my knees, protesting slightly against the cold studio floor. The curious mark Holmes had indicated beneath the victim's left hand proved to be a small, perfectly circular impression in the wood, as if something round had been pressed there with considerable force. I was about to comment on this when Holmes' voice: "Watson, you saw the unusual angle of the paint on his collar." He was standing by the enormous north-facing windows, and his tall figure was silhouetted against the hazy light. "Tell me what you think of the palette itself." I carefully examined the palette still gripped in Blackwood's right hand. The colors are organized in a somewhat strange method, not at all how an artist generally lays his paints, and there's something peculiar about the consistency. Perfectly. Holmes moved with sudden energy, crossing to one of the many easels that populated the studio. "Mr. Whitmore, was it usual for Mr. Blackwood to receive visitors after dark?" The assistant, who had been hovering nervously near the door, began at being addressed. "No, sir. He was most particular about his lighting, said he couldn't work with artificial illumination, something about the gaslights affecting his perception of color. He was quite adamant about it." But Holmes paused before a small side table lifting wah. The beautiful cream-colored paper featured an ornate monogram that I couldn't quite make out from where I stood. Most interestingly, the crusted dirt on the corner of this card indicated it was delivered last evening, well after sunset. "Watson, you estimated the time of death between 9 and 11 o'clock last night." I confirmed, "judging by the level of rigor mortis and the other signs I noted. The chemical odor I detected suggests yes." Holmes interrupted, though not unkindly. "The chemical aspect is most illuminating, but let us not get ahead of ourselves." He turned back to Whitmore. "I'd like a thorough list of anyone who had access to Mr. Blackwood's supplies. His paints, canvases, chemical ingredients, etc." Whitmore appeared perplexed. He did keep a locked cabinet of supplies there in the corner. He'd been experimenting with some new techniques lately. And of course there was his regular supplier, though I don't handle those arrangements myself. And this painting's gestured to the eerily prophetic self-portrait before which Blackwood lay what was to be its fate. "Why, it was commissioned by Lord Pembroke, sir, to be unveiled at the Royal Academy's winter exhibition." Mr. Blackwood. "Watson, observed this brush. Notice anything peculiar?" I took the profited brush, examining it carefully. It appeared to be a perfectly ordinary sable brush, the kind commonly used by artists. "I can detect nothing unusual about it, Holmes. It appears to be a standard brush, though perhaps newer than the others." "I see about the studio precisely." Holmes's smile was enigmatic. "And therein lies our first true clue, Mr. Whitmore. When did Black acquire this particular brush? I am not sure." If the assistant admitted he was rather particular about his brushes, But I don't recall seeing that one before. Holmes nodded, as if this confirmed something in his mind, and moved to examine the painting more closely, his lens catching what little light filtered through the fog-shrouded windows. I watched as he inspected the canvas, especially the areas around the figure of Blackwood himself. "Most extraordinary," he muttered, "the handling of the paint here around the shoulders. Watson, your medical eye might appreciate this. Do you notice how the brush strokes change character in this area?" I joined him at the easel, observing what he indicated. There was a subtle but clear variation in how the paint had been placed in specific spots. The strokes become more tentative here, almost tremulous, rather than the confident style demonstrated in the remainder of the painting. Exactly so. And note that the direction of the strokes most illuminating. Holmes straightened up and pocketed his lens. "Mr. Whitmore, one last question before we leave the chemical cabinet you mentioned. Who has the key that only Mr. Blackwood kept?" Ayesha, he was most insistent about that. Was he? Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, and yet, I observed that the lock has been recently oiled, though there's a distinct accumulation of dust around the keyhole. Curious, wouldn't you say? As we descended the stairs from the studio, I could contain my curiosity. No longer holes, don't you think? Not yet. Watson, we are still gathering data. I must add that the chemical odor you noticed, plus the unusual mark on the floorboard, offer a really interesting possibility. He paused at the front door, examining the brass knob that had caught his attention earlier. "Tell me if you noticed anything unusual about the victim's right hand, the one holding the palette." I mentioned that the position seemed somewhat unnatural, but did you notice the slight discoloration between the thumb and forefinger most suggestive? Holmes put on his gloves as we stepped out into the fog. "Bound Street. Now I believe we have an appointment with Lord Pembroke, though I suspect his lordship's involvement in this affair to be rather different than it appears." A hansom cab materialized out of the fog at Holmes' signal, and as we climbed in, I reflected that the mystery seemed to be deepening rather than clarifying. The dead artist, the prophetic painting, the curious chemical cabinet, and now this business with Lord Pembroke. How did it all connect? But I knew from long experience that Holmes would reveal his thoughts only when he was ready, not before. Chapter 3, A Study in Shadows. Lord Pembroke's Mayfair residence stood in marked contrast to the artistic disarray of Blackwood's studio. The morning fog had begun to lift as our hansom deposited us before an imposing townhouse, its white stone facade gleaming weightily in the strength of sunlight. The neighborhood spoke of old money and established position, with its broad streets and carefully maintained gardens, so different from the bohemian quarter we had just left as we were shown into his lordship's stud. A gigantic desk of polished mahogany dominated the room, its surface structured with military precision, except for that one corner where the Japanese letter lay half-covered. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, dissipating the last of the morning's chill. Lord Pembroke himself was occupied with his morning correspondence when we entered, his silver pen scratching across expensive paper. He was a tall man, elegantly dressed in the latest fashion, with the carefully cultivated appearance of an artistic patron who wished to appear more bohemian than his aristocratic background might suggest. "Ah, the infamous portrait, Lord Pembroke," said after we had explained our presence. He settled into his chair before continuing. "Poor Blackwood, a G." Brooke's hand twitched almost imperceptibly, and he became increasingly fascinated with particular technological experiments. Lord Pembroke moved to the sideboard, where a crystal decanter caught the morning light. He poured himself a glass of sherry without offering us any, a subtle breach of etiquette that caused my friend's eyebrow to lift slightly. Something about advancing the drying time of oils, consulted frequently with a chemical supplier, a Thaddeus Grove. I suppose the name was rather out of character for him to engage in such technical topics. Holmes' brows raised slightly as he mentioned the nature of these experiments. "My dear colleague, I am a pawn of the arts, not a practitioner." Lord Pembroke paused and frowned as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. The morning light threw The windows cast bizarre shadows on his face. He did remark something really odd at our previous meeting about gaining immortality through his work, pure artist fantasy. I assumed at the time of the last meeting. Holmes said, carefully leaning forward somewhat in his chair, when did it take place? 3 days ago, herein this very room. He appeared rather disturbed. Lord PMR's hand moved with calculated casualness to cover the Japanese letter more thoroughly with other papers. The movement may have appeared natural to most observers, but I had learned to recognize when my friend's attention was particularly engaged, and his eyes narrowed slightly at this gesture. I see you maintain correspondence with Japan. My Lord Holmes' tone was carefully neutral, but I could detect a keen interest beneath his casual inquiry. A slight flush appeared high on Lord Pembroke's cheeks. You noticed," he responded, his own tone equally studied. "A personal letter from a friend, nothing to do with this unfortunate business." I assure you his fingers drummed once on the desk before he caught himself and stilled them. "And the portrait itself, you commissioned it for the Royal Academy's winter exhibition." Holmes seamlessly shifted the subject, though I knew him well enough to realize that he had noted every nuance of Lord Pembroke's reaction. "Yes, though. I'm beginning to wonder if that was wise. Blackwood's reputation for eccentricity was growing. There was some talk in artistic circles about his unusual methods." "Unusual in what way?" Holmes inquired. "Oh, technical matters. Mostly are something about his new approach to oils." The art dealer Thornton seemed particularly concerned about it, and said Blackwood was becoming unreliable. Lord Pembroke had regained his calm now, but his gaze kept drifting to the corner of his desk where the Japanese letter remained hidden as we took our departure. I noticed Holmes had grown unusually silent, his forehead furrowed in that manner that indicated me he was deep in contemplation. The fog had cleared completely, leaving behind a fresh fall day that seemed somehow at odds with the grim mystery. We were researching the morning sunlight through long shadows across the pavement, not resembling the shadows that seemed to be forming around this odd case. "What are you thinking, Holmes?" I ventured as we proceeded toward Piccadilly, our footsteps ringing on the fashionable street. "I am thinking, Watson, that we must pay a visit to Mr. Grove's establishment." He paused to light his pipe. The match flared briefly in the morning light, but I anticipate we will find his establishment most enlightening. "The Japanese letter seemed to interest you tremendously, so I said yes, albeit perhaps not for the reasons you might assume." "Did you notice how fast his lordship moved to cover it?" Most provocative. Holmes puffed thoughtfully at his pipe, sending rings of smoke into the clear air. "But let us get ahead of ourselves. First, let us see what Mr. Grove has to say about Blackwood's experiments." As we made our way toward Clerkenwell, I couldn't help but feel that the case was becoming more complex rather than less. The dead artist, the prophetic painting, the curious experiments, the hastily concealed letter. How did it all connect? But I knew Holmes well enough to recognize that he was. Chapter 4. The Chemistry of Art. Mr. Grove's chemical supply shop occupied a narrow building in Clarendon, wedged between a bookbinder's workshop and a printer's establishment. The interior proved to be a curious mixture of laboratory and warehouse, with shelves reaching to the ceiling, laden with bottles and jars of every description. The air held a complex mixture of odors that reminded me forcibly of the strange chemical smell I had detected around Blackwood's body. The proprietor, Thaddeus Grove, he adjusted these spectacles constantly as he spoke, a tendency that seemed to deepen with his obvious worry about our questions. Mr. Blackwood, most picky about his criteria. Grove, rummaging through a leather-bound ledger, always insisted on producing certain concoctions himself and had his own formulas. It is unusual for an artist to display such attention in the chemical qualities of his materials. Holmes examined the ledger with great attention, traced his finger down columns of clean entries. These quantities appear unusually enormous for an artist's needs. 5 pounds of linseed oil accelerant in a single week. And this notation here regarding cadmium compounds. He spoke of a special commission about obtaining unprecedented outcomes. Groves stopped, his fingers pulling frantically at his spectacles again. I attempted to warn him about the dangers of certain combinations, but he wouldn't listen, saying he was under pressure to complete the work quickly. Holmes inquired harshly. Groves's hands trembled slightly. As he adjusted his spectacles once more, I shouldn't say there were several interested individuals. An art dealer had been making inquiries about his new technique. The man got rather emphatic about breaking off, suddenly realizing he'd spoken too much, this art dealer. Holmes pressed his keen eyes fixated on Grove's worried face. He would be Mr. Thornton. Perhaps Grove began violently at the name that is, I really shouldn't come. Mr. Grove, Holmes said quietly, you've already indicated his involvement. Better to tell us what you know now. The chemist seemed to deflate slightly. Yes. Mr. Thornton, he and Mr. Blackwood had several disagreements. They quarreled here in the shop last week. I didn't mean to overhear, but their voices were raised something about exclusive rights to a new technique. These accelerants, Holmes said, returning to the ledger, they would produce most unusual effects when combined with certain ought. Oh yes, he developed some method of making oil paintings dry in hours rather than days, quite remarkable. Really though, potentially dangerous if one does not understand the chemical principles involved. The wrong combination of accelerants could produce, well, most unfortunate effects. Holmes' eyes narrowed somewhat. These are dreadful repercussions. Do they include any specific bodily symptoms? I couldn't say for certain, Grove responded, though his increased fidgeting hinted otherwise. I did advise him about sufficient ventilation. Some of these compounds, when mixed with certain oils, indeed. Holmes suddenly turned his attention to a shelf behind the counter. Those circular marks on your spectacles match precisely with these protective goggles here. You've been conducting some experiments of your own. Perhaps. Grove's hand flew to his spectacles. Well, yes. One must verify the safety of new compounds. Professional responsibility, you understand. As we left the shop, Holmes suddenly stopped at the corner of I frowned, trying to recall the exact details. Actually, I'm not entirely certain, though. I remember thinking the position seemed unnatural for an artist at work. Exactly. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar light. That told me he was following a promising line of inquiry, and now I believe we should have a word with Mr. Thornton. But first, I must send a telegram regarding certain chemical properties of cadmium yellow. He consulted his watch. The laboratory at St. Bartholomew. Holmes, surely you don't think Grove was involved in Blackwood's death? Think Watson, those protective goggles, the nervous manner, the extensive knowledge of potentially dangerous compounds. It's all suggestive, wouldn't you say, but not conclusive. No, there's something else at work here. Something about those quantities, the ledger, enormous amounts of materials. Not just the amounts, Watson, but the timing of the purchases rose considerably. 3 weeks ago, precisely when Lord Pembroke commissioned the portrait. But he paused, his brow furrowed in concentration. The paint on Blackwood's collar, the position of the palette, those peculiar traces on the flooring, they suggest something quite different. A gorgeous cab clattered past, splashing across a puddle left by the early fog. Holmes appeared lost in thought, his finger tapping against his chin in that characteristic gesture I knew so well, that formula Lord Pembroke showed us, he mused. It was incomplete deliberately, so I suspect. But why and what of Thornton's interest in the technique? An art dealer concerned with chemical processes seems somewhat out of character, wouldn't you say? Before I could respond, Holmes had hailed a passing cab to the telegraph office and instructed the driver simply once. Mr. Thornton's gallery should be open by now, and I believe he will have some intriguing insights regarding the relationship between art and chemistry as we rattle through the London streets. I couldn't help but sense that we were approaching some crucial understanding. The chemical components of the case seemed to be taking precedence over the artistic, but I knew houses well enough to believe that all these seemingly disparate threads would finally weave together into a coherent whole. Chapter 5. The art dealer's tale. After transmitting his message to send, Bartholomew's laboratory houses led us through the elegant alleys of Bond Street. where London's greatest art galleries showed their treasures beneath sparkling plate glass windows. Reginald Thornton's establishment proved to be one of the most impressive, with its elegant facade speaking of considerable success in his trade. The interior matched the promise of its exterior, with several well-appointed rooms displaying paintings that even my untutored eye could recognize as valuable. Clark informed us that Mr. Thornton was highly busy with urgent work, but Holmes' card had an almost instantaneous effect. The man himself matched his surroundings, expensively dressed, yet with an air of calculated dishevelment that suggested he wished to appear more bohemian than his circumstances indicated. He was consulting his pocket watch as we entered his private office room, whose walls were covered with what appeared to be preliminary sketches by various artist gentlemen. He said curtly while remaining standing behind his desk, "I must be brief. I have an important meeting across town in 30 minutes. "We will not keep you long," Holmes said effortlessly. Uninvited into one of the leather-armed chairs, "We're here for Gerald Blackwood." Thorin's expression flickered momentarily. "Tragic business, of course. But I don't see what I can add now, if you'll pardon me. Lord Pembroke commissioned the picture." Holmes interrupted. "You were to manage the sale." "I believe I manage many artworks, Mr. Holmes. Now I have numerous pressing appointments inquisitive." Holmes wondered if an art dealer of your status would be so interested in chemical processes. Thornton's hand, reaching for some papers on his desk, paused almost imperceptibly. "I'm sure. I don't know what you mean. The technical aspects of painting are naturally of some interest to those in the trade, but come now. Mr. Thornton Blackwood's new technique was causing quite a stir in artistic circles, was it not? Rumors and gossip." Thornton glanced at his watch again. "Artists are forever claiming revolutionary breakthroughs. 99% of them amount to nothing now. I really have to insist." Strokes on his final painting, Holmes pressed, "most unusually, wouldn't you say, particularly about the shoulders?" "I haven't explored the working question." Thornton's voice had become sharp, "and I had a very important client waiting. More important than the Royal Academy's winter exhibition." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "I understand Blackwood's portrait was to be the centerpiece. As I said, I handle many paintings. Now if you've quite finished." He reached for his coat. "One final question," Holmes said, rising. "The Japanese art market, quite lucrative, I understand." Thornton paused, his coat half on. "I really couldn't say. My dealings are primarily European." "Good day, gentlemen." As we descended the gallery's elegant staircase, I noticed Holmes glanced back thoughtfully at something near Thornton's desk before we left, a small Japan box that seemed out of place among the artistic clutter outside. The afternoon had grown cold, a bitter wind whipping down Bond Street and setting the Carey's horses stamping uneasily. "Well, Watson, what did you make of our art dealer?" He seemed remarkably eager to be rid of us. "Indeed. And did you notice anything else peculiar about him?" I thought for a moment. "His hands, they were perfectly manicured, yet there was a slight stain between his thumb and forefinger, rather like the mark we observed on Blackwood's hand." "Excellent, Watson. And the Japan box, I noticed. You seemed interested in it, though." "I couldn't see why not. Consider its location, pushed almost out of sight behind the desk, yet not quite hidden, and its surface recently cleaned, though dust had accumulated on everything else in the office. Most suggestive, wouldn't you say?" Before I could respond, Holmes abruptly hailed a passing cab back to Baker Street, instructing the driver that we must first stop at St. Bartholomew's. I predict a most interesting reaction to my tea about those cadmium compounds as our cab rocked through the twilight streets. I thought what we had learnt, or rather what we had failed to gain from our discussion with Thornton, his obvious desperation to get rid of us, his cautious avoidance of explaining Blackwood's technique, the curious stains on his hands, how could it all connect to the dead artist and that hauntingly prophetic painting? But Holmes had plunged into one of his thoughtful silences, and I knew from long experience that he would share his theories only when he was ready. The chemical odor I had sensed surrounding Blackwood's body seemed to hover in my memory, connecting the image of that strange pallet position and the curious markings on the studio floor. Something was beginning to take shape in my mind, though I couldn't quite grasp it. Holmes' look indicated he was several steps ahead as usual, pursuing a trail of evidence that remained unseen to my eyes. Chapter 6. A Model's Tale and our stop at Bartholomew proved quite enlightening. Holmes spent several minutes examining the laboratory's analysis of the cadmium compounds, his expression growing increasingly intent as he studied the results. Just as I suspected, Watson remarked as we left the particular reaction between these pigments and certain accelerants most suggestive, though I shall need to confirm one detail before drawing any firm conclusions. Upon our return to Baker Street that evening, we found a visitor awaiting us in our sitting room, the Lady Rose. As we entered, I was struck by her evident beauty, despite the signs of recent distress on her features. Her black garments emphasizing the pallor of her face and the redness around her eyes that spoke of many shed tears. "Miss Elena Reed, Mrs. Hudson declared before quietly withdrawing. "Pray be seated," Madame Holmes replied, gently waving to the chair she had vacated. "You've come regarding Gerald Blackwood." "I comprehend," the lady started. "How could you know the paint track is on your glove, madam?" "The specific shade of violet that I noticed in Blackwood studio this morning, an artist's hue, and one he was particularly fond of utilizing in his recent portraits." Miss Reed's serenity faltered slightly with this reminder. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, I was his model, but more than that," her voice faltered. "You were engaged to be married," Holmes said softly. A tear rolled down her cheek, not officially announced, but "Yes, Gerald and I. It began with the portraits, you see. He saw something in me that no one else had ever noticed, the way he painted me." She withdrew a small photograph from her reticule and passed it to Holmes. "This was his first portrait of me 6 months ago." I leaned over to examine the photograph, and even in the monochrome reproduction, the artistry was evident. A masterful study of light and shadow that seemed to capture not only the lady's physical beauty, but also something of her inner nature. "When did your relationship with Mr. Blackwood begin to change?" Holmes inquired about returning the photograph 3 months ago. "He asked me to sit for another portrait, but this time he talked as he painted about his hopes and dreams about the future." She twisted her handkerchief in her lap. "But everything changed when he began his experiments, which would be chemical experiments." Holmes asked, his interest clearly piqued. "Yes, he became obsessed with this new technique he was developing. Spent hours in his studio, mixing paints and chemicals, said it would revolutionize the art world." She paused, dabbing at her eyes. "That's when Mr. Thornton began to show an unusual interest in Gerald's work." Reginald Thornton, the art dealer, yes, but his interest wasn't just in the paintings. Miss Reed's voice toughened somewhat. "He began showing at the studio during my sittings, creating excuses to be there. His attention grew unpleasant." Holmes leaned forward in his chair. "Please be specific." Miss Reed began with subtle compliments and small gifts that I couldn't politely refuse, but then he began suggesting that he could advance my career and introduce me to other artists. When I declined, he became more insistent, and Gerald noticed and confronted him about it. When this confrontation occurred a week ago, I wasn't supposed to overhear, but I was changing behind the screen after a sitting, and Thornton was demanding something, a formula, which Gerald refused, telling him to leave and never return. Thornton became angry, said Gerald would regret his decision. I saw Holmes's eyes sharpen with interest, and after this confrontation, Thornton began appearing everywhere I went, exhibition shops, even outside my home. It was as if he was watching my every move. Then 3 days ago, Gerald told me he had something important to tell me something about Thornton, but he said it wasn't safe to discuss it. Then he promised to explain everything after he finished the portrait for Lord Pemmer. Her voice broke. "That was the last time I saw him alive." Holmes sat in silence for a moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The paint on your glove suggests you visited the studio this morning, before coming here." "Yes." Miss Reed's hands trembled slightly. "I had to understand, but that painting, Mr. Holmes, that horrible painting showing his death, how could such a thing be possible?" That Madam is precisely what we must determine. Now pray tell me, did you notice anything unusual about the chemical cabinet in the studio during your visit, only that it was open? Gerald always kept it locked. He was very particular about his new materials indeed. Holmes exchanged a significant look with me, and the Japan box that usually sat upon it gone, I noticed. Because Gerald always placed his special brushes there, the ones he used only for his new technique. Holmes rose and began pacing the room, his manner suddenly energetic. Miss Reed, you have provided us with several most illuminating details, I believe. I begin to see the outline of events. Though much remains to be proved, he stopped suddenly. One final question. Did you observe any unusual odor in the studio this morning? Anything similar to what you might have noticed during your last sitting, now that you mention it? Yes. A strange sweet smell, rather like the one I noticed when Gerald was working with his new paints, but stronger after Miss Reed. Watson. But we must not let passion cloud our judgment. But I must add that business about the Japan box. He broke off, reaching for his pipe. We must act swiftly now. If I am correct about the chemical components of this case, there may be more at stake than a single murder. What do you mean? Consider, Watson, technology that lets oil paintings to dry in hours, instead of days. Think of the consequences. The potential for forgeries alone. He paused, striking a match. No, there are depths to this case we have not yet delved. But I believe our next steps are apparent, and they are. Holmes grimly smirked through the pipe smoke. We must make another visit to Mr. Grove's firm. But this time, Watson, we will do so under cover of darkness at the Chevin. The final stroke. The November night had grown bitterly cold by the time Holmes and I found ourselves in the narrow street behind Grove's chemical shop. A thick fog had descended once more, transforming the gas lamps into dim halos that barely penetrated the gloom. My friend had insisted we wait until well past midnight before proceeding with this phase of his investigation, and I confess the chill had begun to seep through my heaviest coat. Watson, Holmes whispered as we made our way. The lock on the back door offered little barrier to Holmes' pictures, and within moments, we were inside the shop's back room. Holmes instantly lit a black lantern, keeping its beam carefully guarded. The room presented a totally different look by night, with rows of bottles shining dully in the lantern's light, their contents casting odd shadows on the walls. The chemical odors seemed more pronounced in the stillness of the night, reminding me uncomfortably of the scene in Blackwood Studio. Holmes moved with purpose toward a particular cabinet, one we hadn't examined during our previous visit. His fingers traced the edge of its lock thoughtfully. He breathed, examining it closely. Recently opened. You see, the oil is still fresh. His lens came out, catching what little light was available in here. The same distinct. Surely you don't think? Quietly, Watson. His fingers immediately seized my arm, and footsteps could be heard approaching from the street. We lowered the lantern and pulled ourselves into the shadows behind a large wooden cabinet. The footsteps got closer, accompanied by the sound of a key turning in the front door lock. Through the glass panels dividing the rear area from the business itself, I could see a figure approaching cautiously through the darkness. Just as I expected, Holmes exhaled so quietly I could barely hear him, though I admit I didn't anticipate quite such convenient time. The figure moved into the back room, providing their own light in its dull glow. I recognized Thaddeus Grove, but his jittery manner seemed even more obvious than usual. He proceeded to the cabinet Holmes had been investigating, his hands shaking slightly as he retrieved a small leather-bound notepad. A second pair of footsteps could be heard. Grove froze and hurriedly tucked the notepad into his coat pocket. The new visitor entered without attempting to be quiet, footfall keen and intent on the hardwood floor, while the sharp voice of Reginald Thornton cut through the darkness. Did you find it, Mr. Thornton? Grove's voice quavered. I was merely checking some records. Don't play games with me. Grove, you know what I need. The formula. Blackwood's original notes must be here someplace, but I have informed you that I don't have them. Whatever Blackwood discovered, he kept the essential details to himself. You're lying. Thornton's voice had grown dangerous. You helped him develop the technique. You must know how it works. I only supplied standard material. The real breakthrough was all Blackwood's work. And now that he's dead, yes, Thornton cut in now. That he's dead, you're the only one who might know his secrets, and with that detective, Holmes and his dull-witted doctor friend closing in, we need to move quickly. Grove's uneasy shuffling could be heard in the dark. What do you mean? I've booked passage to Japan. The ship departs tomorrow at 3, that metal. Some detective is making too much progress. We need to be on that ship. Grove has Blackwood's recipe in hand. Japan. Grove's voice quavered, but wouldn't. You rather stay and face the consequences? Tomorrow the docks 3 o'clock. Bring everything, the formula, the notes, everything. We can create a fortune in Japan where no one will find us. I felt Holmes tense next me, ready to help if needed, but at that moment, a police whistle heard in the street outside. Both men began violently remembering 3 o'clock at the docks. Thornton shouted, "Don't be late or you'll repent it." Grove hurriedly departed after hearing his departing footsteps. The fog had thickened more by the time we emerged from our hiding place. Holmes led us quickly through the maze of streets in his own footsteps, sure despite the bad visibility. It wasn't until we were safely back in our living room at Baker Street, with a fresh fire blazing in the fireplace, that he finally broke his thoughtful silence. "Well, Watson, what do you make of their planned escape to Japan? Surely we must alert Ladd immediately." "All in good time, my friend." Holmes settled into his favorite chair, reaching for his pipe. "Remember, we need more than just flight. To prove guilt, though, I must say this development fits perfectly with what the chemical analysis revealed." He paused to puff at his pipe, sending rings of smoke toward the ceiling. "Tell me what you made of." Grove's notebook. Could it contain Blackwood's formula? Remember the circle marks on Grove's spectacles? The same marks we noticed. He broke off quickly. But we get ahead of ourselves. Tomorrow will be soon enough to create our ultimate trap. However, I think, Watson, you might want to carry your gun when we visit the docks." The fire roared in the grate as Holmes went into one of his pondering silences. But I could see his keen eyes were light with anticipation of action, whatever he had surmised from the night's happenings. I knew tomorrow would bring this unusual case to a close. The mystery of the living portrait, an apparently impossible painting that prophesied its creator's death, was nearly solved. Chapter 8. The Portrait Talks. The fog that had dogged London during our research had finally lifted by 3 o'clock the following afternoon, revealing a steel-gray sky over the Thames docks. Holmes, Ladd, and I, accompanied by some of Scotland Yard's most trusted men, had taken up positions amid the shipping crates and warehouses long before the allotted hour. "Remember, Ladd," Holmes had murmured as we waited, "let them make the exchange before moving in. We need proof of both the formula and their intended flight. We don't have long to wait." Grove arrived first, his uneasy manner even more obvious than usual, clutching a leather portfolio across his breast. Thornton came moments later, marching purposefully up the dock with the air of a man who felt himself already safely away. "You have it all," Thornton said without preface. Grove nodded jerkily. "Everything, the formulas, the notes regarding the accelerant. Wonderful. Our ship awaits after we reach Japan." "That's pretty far away, gents," Holmes' voice boomed out as he came from behind a stack of crates. Ladd's men emerged from their hiding spots, revolvers drawn. What ensued was brief, but savage. Thornton attempted to leave, nearly reaching the gangplank of a neighboring boat, before being tackled to the rough boards of the pier. Grove, demonstrating more prudence, surrendered promptly once both men were securely chained. Holmes turned to Thornton with that weird smile I had seen so often at the end of a case or a brilliant plot. "Mr. Thornton, albeit possibly too clever by half, the picture that anticipated its creator's death was a superb touch aimed to indicate something supernatural rather than criminal." Thornton maintained a stony silence, but Grove had began to shake noticeably. "Now," Ladd continued, pulling his revolver and aiming it at Grove, "one of you should start talking." Grove broke immediately. It was all his idea, he burst out, nodding toward Thornton. He paid me to modify Blackwood's materials. Specific compounds of cadmium mixed with the oils, said it would teach the artist a lesson. Shut up, you fool, Thornton snailed. But Grove was beyond stopping. He had me alter the chemical composition, gradually over weeks. The modifications to the oils, the accelerants, all designed to create specific effects when combined. I didn't know he meant to kill anyone. Holmes nodded. The chemical study from St. Bartholomew's proved the existence of these changed substances. But it was about more than simply the artist's reputation, wasn't it, Mr. Thornton? Thornton's face had taken on an unpleasant expression, that arrogant fool with everything. Talent recognized, and his voice broke somewhat. Miss Reed, I offered her world connection prospects, but she only had eyes for him and his horrible paintings, so you devised a scheme. Holmes continued to discredit Blackwood with a seemingly impossible painting that predicted its creator's death. The fast-drying oils would make it appear the painting was completed before his death when, in fact, I interjected, finally seeing the pattern. The painting was done under duress shortly before the murder, precisely what yes, and those same chemicals produced the distinct odor you noticed at the crime scene. Watson's entire system required weeks of preparation, gradually modifying Blackwood's materials, arranging the commission through Lord Pembroke, all leading to that final night when you forced him to paint his own death scene before murdering him. Ladd signaled his men to take the prisoners away. Thornton's composure completely shattered, began shouting about missed opportunities and betrayal. Grove simply wept. Later, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat in his favorite chair contemplating the fire. Through a cloud of pipe smoke there. Holmes indeed, though I suspect Miss Reed will find some comfort in knowing that justice has been served. He tapped out his pipe thoughtfully. You know, Watson, there's a curious parallel between art and crime. Both require technique, preparation, and a certain creative vision. The difference lies purely in the moral dimension of their execution, and the fact that crime, unlike art, must eventually answer to justice. I added, precisely, my dear Watson. Thank you for tuning in to Sherlock Mysteries. If you enjoyed the intrigue and suspense, please subscribe and click the bell symbol to stay up to speed on more exciting detective adventures. Your support keeps the stories coming and the mysteries alive.